The Weirwood trees of A Song of Ice and Fire and the Erdtree of Elden Ring may both be dead trees taken over by fungus. This is a popular fan theory in both series, and the parallels between them are very strong, and I think the fact that this has independently popped up in each of these fandoms with good evidence makes both of these theories stronger. This is actually the second video in a row on my channel that's covering the many similarities between A Song of Ice and Fire lore and world building and Elden Ring lore and world building. You don't have to watch in order, you can go and watch part 1 after this, it's fine, it's going to make complete sense to you. But if you're wondering where some of these comments that I'm going to be responding to on screen came from, they were from part 1. And I'm sure there's going to be future parts to this series, so if at any point you have something to add, definitely do so down there in the comments. So today what I would like to do is start with this mushroom theory that I just brought up and then go into just a couple other connections that I see between these two properties, respond to a few of those comments from the last video, and even go into a little bit of just how we know what George R. R. Martin worked on and what he didn't for Elden Ring. Also, just to give a little disclaimer in case you haven't seen part 1, I'm coming at this from more of A Song of Ice and Fire perspective and doing my best to learn Elden Ring as I go. Obviously, the lore of both of these properties is incredibly complicated, so if I do get little things wrong about Elden Ring, definitely feel free to correct me down there in the comments, and we're just basically trying to all come together to get to the bottom of some of the mysteries in both of these properties. So starting with the mushroom theory and its details on the Elden Ring side, you should look to a video put out by Zeostorm, which I'm going to be adding to the playlist that I will have at one of the end cards here. It's just a playlist of some of these videos and then some good Elden Ring videos that I've sort of used as a source. And it was pointed out to me in the comments that I should check out this video, and in that video he actually shows a news article that sort of credits him with this theory, so I think it's safe to say that is the origin point for this theory in Elden Ring. The video itself is very good and, in my opinion, worth watching. It actually goes into a lot of the science behind some various types of mushrooms that could have influenced very specific things within Elden Ring. He makes the comparison between Ranni the Witch's appearance and an indigo milk-cap mushroom that I think is a very strong connection, and he also compares something called the fingers to a mushroom type called Dead Man's Fingers. Now, we talked about Ranni in the last episode quite a bit, but we didn't talk much about the fingers at all. And there are the 3 fingers and the 2 fingers. Basically what these are is they are a way for the outer gods to communicate to mortals, and the way that they communicate is by the movement of these fingers. As far as I understand it, the 2 fingers are a vassal of the Erdtree that basically communicates the will of the Erdtree to people. In addition to this, I've also heard theories that basically the 2 fingers and the 3 fingers are split from what once was essentially one conjoined hand, and that would sort of make some sense because 3 fingers and 2 fingers add up to the 5 fingers you have on a hand, but I'm not entirely sure that that's relevant or even how proven that is. Maybe you can let me know down in the comments. So if the Erdtree itself is a vessel of the greater will, and essentially the 2 fingers are used to communicate that will to mortals, well then there is some connection going on between the Erdtree and the fingers. Now I think by the end of this we will recognize the way they are connected is probably very much like a mycelial network. Now for those of you who don't know, in real life there is essentially mycelium everywhere throughout the ground, and within a forest, trees can use this mycelial network and their roots to communicate. Essentially what happens is if there's like a tree disease that is going on, basically they can communicate that and they can sort of quarantine off diseased trees. If there's like a resource shortage or something like that, they can even apparently transport resources to different trees that are in need of it using these mycelial networks. Now, keep in mind, I am not a scientist, and I am definitely not a tree scientist. This is all just based off of articles that I've read about this in the past, but this is something that I do find really fascinating. And I think George R. R. Martin finds it fascinating too because, well, George R. R. Martin is not only a sci-fi writer who has written a lot of science-y stories, so he's sort of up to date on a lot of that stuff, he's also a big old lovable hippie. So it makes a lot of sense then that he has his entire magic system based around trees and that he would be up to date on scientific concepts about trees. And honestly, the fact that it's mushrooms might even make a little bit more sense because actually then all of his magic trees that he's basing his systems around are actually magic mushrooms, which is, you know, a bit of a hippie thing. It really does fit pretty well with what we see in game, what we see in A Song of Ice and Fire, which we'll get to in a minute, and what we know about George R. R. Martin. The thing about the Weirwood trees and the Erdtree is that they are both, from what we can tell, dead remnants of what used to be a different looking tree. We talked about this a little bit in the last episode, and some people pointed out further in the comments that the Erdtree itself seems to be parasitic. It seems to have taken over what was once the great tree, and it is now essentially ruling the lands between as some sort of parasite. When you walk through the forest, if you find a dead tree, the thing that you are likely to find is that it will be completely taken over by mushrooms, so this really fits really well. I even had a tree in my yard pretty recently that was still standing, but you could sort of tell that the tree was dead, and it had been just taken over by different mushrooms that were eating away at it, and then eventually in a big storm it fell down. So when this world order built through these trees is, getting to the point where it's ready to fall and the cycle of rebirth can happen and a new order can come and take its place, it would make a lot of sense that this tree is there still standing but completely taken over by parasitic fungus. So I think something that shouldn't be ignored in all of this is the fact that both the Erdtree and the weirwood trees seem to feed off of dead things, in the way that mushrooms come in and eat up dead trees, and essentially in the ground when you bury someone or something, they are broken down and essentially eaten away by organisms in the ground. Mycelium, fungus, and different things like that are basically the big recycling plant for life, and life is the thing that powers them. In George R.R. Martin's works, only death can pay for life. It is the source of his magic, and it would therefore make a lot of sense that the source of this magic is mushroom-based. George R.R. Martin likes his magic to have rules, and he likes those rules to, on some level or another, make sense to him. I put out a video a few months ago about how essentially all of the different branches of magic in A Song of Ice and Fire are life-based magic, and therefore this is probably the method through which it all makes sense to George, because the magic is through mushrooms, and mushrooms feed off of dead things, and basically even when you see like fire magic done in A Song of Ice and Fire, they are burning wood or they are burning people. Everything requires a sacrifice, it all feeds off of life and blood, and that's the energy that you can use to do magic. Even in its most harmless form, like in real life, basically, when you are trying to have the magic of life being created or sustained, you need to do that through things like eating, which when you're eating, you are eating other life, whether it is animals or plant life. You are constantly needing to eat other life in order to sustain the magic that is life itself. Now, for those of you whose only exposure to George R.R. Martin lore was watching the show Game of Thrones, you should know that they really toned down on the blood magic and all of the creepiness of the magic system in a Game of Thrones. In the books, the Northman culture, the old ways, is entirely built around blood sacrifice to these weirwood trees, and that is essentially how they pray to the old gods. This is hidden a little bit away in the background. In the very beginning, we get a scene where Ned Stark is cleaning the blood off of his blade at the roots of the heart tree and essentially wiping blood into the grass, and that is a little hint of the still remaining culture of sacrificing to these weirwoods. But then later on, as you go throughout the books, you have Northman families talk about stringing up entrails in the branches of these heart trees, and you have a situation where right at the end of Dance with Dragons, Bran is wed up to the heart trees and he is looking through the eyes of a weirwood, and he is seeing blood sacrifice being done to feed the trees, and the line is Bran Stark could taste the blood. So he's wed to the trees, he is the tree at that moment, and he can taste the blood because they are feeding the blood and the life force into the trees. The other thing that we see in both Elden Ring and A Song of Ice and Fire is that down deep in the roots of these trees there are many dead bodies. As far as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, because again, Elden Ring is the thing that I am much newer to learning about, the part of the Erdtree that you actually go into when you die, or that takes in the death and sort of feeds the rest of the tree, is the roots, and in A Song of Ice and Fire, when Bran Stark goes to the cave with the three-eyed crow and he meets the children of the forest, he finds that they are all deep down in the roots of these trees, and there are many skeletons of children of the forest and giants who went to die within the roots. Now, also in A Song of Ice and Fire, we see these figures called green seers who are entwined in the roots, essentially sitting on weirwood root thrones, and they are essentially having their life sustained forever. Their bodies are kept alive by the roots of these trees, and probably by being fed the life energy of other people or other things that are sacrificed to the trees. That's probably like how this magic works, because again, only death can pay for life. So if you have these bodies that are eternally sustained by the roots of these trees, it's very likely that that's what the blood and life sacrifice that we see going into the trees is going towards feeding. There is also a very interesting thing about how essentially these trees seem to grant access via their magic to the ability to warg. Now, this is slightly speculative, but I honestly don't think it's really that speculative. I think it's just true that the ability to warg initially comes from these weirwood trees. It is all of these first men houses who have worshipped these trees for ages now that have this warging ability, and what this allows them to do is to jump into the minds of wolves or ravens or things like that, and see through their eyes, essentially merge with their consciousness. This warging ability is a magic that is said to be used by the children of the forest, who have been worshipping these trees for even longer than people have been in Westeros. So they also had this ability to jump consciousnesses into fish and beasts and birds, and this is told to us from the very first book. There's also this very interesting line from Bran Stark when he's down in the roots of these trees and he's learning from his mentor on how to use all of his magic. He jumps into the mind of a crow, and when he comes back, he says, "Hey, there was someone else in that bird. I could feel someone in that bird." And Bloodraven tells him that yes, there was a child of the forest who died long ago who is living on in the mind of that bird. And Bran asks him if all of these crows have children of the forest living in them, and Bloodraven tells him yes, all of them. So essentially all of these birds, these ravens and crows, who watch over Westeros and who they use to literally send messages, are inhabited by the minds of children of the forest who have gone and died and gone into the trees. So basically these trees do give you some sort of magical form of eternal life in the bodies or minds of these different animals, and you're able to just jump from animal to animal forever, essentially, if you apparently go into these trees when you die. At least that's what seems to be set up on some level or another. So when you combine that with the fact that the children of the forest and their greenseers seem to be able to use these trees to spy on people, and they have taught the people to pray to these trees, and they have taught the people to send messages with these ravens, they are essentially building the world's largest magical weirwood-based spy network, and all of Westeros, when they're following the old ways, seems to be under that spy network. Basically, these trees are very magically powerful and in complete control of this entire land. This is something that would likely be missed if you only watched the television show and didn't ever read the books, because, well, they took a lot of this magic out of the television show completely. The other thing about the weirwood trees that's pretty interesting and feels connected to the way that the Erdtree connects to, say, the fingers and the minor Erdtrees is that all the weirwoods themselves are often speculated to be connected. The roots of these trees seem to all go way deep down into the earth, and they all seem to link up to these underground rivers, and eventually it seems pretty likely that they go far enough down where they all link up to each other. So they form this giant network, and it's essentially just like the giant mycelial network that we were talking about a little earlier. Basically, the fact that these things are living mostly underground in a giant connected network and only have little sprouts popping up in the weirwood trees that we see above the surface, and the fact that they seem to be feeding off of dead things, are a couple different things that tie these weirwood trees into being potentially mushrooms. Within the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom, this giant connected hive mind of weirwood trees is affectionately referred to as the weirwood.net. It's connected sort of in the way computers are, and sort of gives you the ability to spy everywhere in the same way that, the internet does. Basically, all of Westeros has been living under the NSA for, 8,000 years or more. So when you compare this connected network of weirwood trees to the Erdtree and their connection to the minor Erdtrees and potentially to the fingers and potentially to just tons of other trees and things throughout the lands between, basically these two things are forming the same exact picture. It is a giant parasitic network based around a dead tree that's taken over by fungus that all feeds off of death. The weirwoods and the Erdtree are mushrooms. It really seems like that is the most likely option for both of these properties, and both of those ideas probably, in my opinion, came from George R.R. Martin. Now, the interesting thing about all of this, and the thing that I kind of want to point out, is that I'm not really trying to, make up new connections or new theories based off of, something that happens in Elden Ring or A Song of Ice and Fire. What I think it's really useful for doing is when something is already speculated with good evidence in one of these properties, and then it matches up with something that's talked about in the other property, I think it just makes the theory stronger in general. Like the fact that Elden Ring and A Song of Ice and Fire both have so many hints that these trees are acting like a giant fungal network and that the trees themselves are dead or corrupted and that the original magic has been changed, well then I think that's possibly a concept that George R. R. Martin has reused on some level for both of these stories. There was even a comment on my last video asking, well, why would George R. R. Martin make both of these stories so similar? And the thing you should know about George R. R. Martin is that he's a great writer, but he's also a very great borrower. One of the things that George R. R. Martin is world class at is taking inspiration from old mythologies and other stories and then just twisting it just enough to fit it into the world that he's currently building or the story he's currently working on. And in addition to borrowing from mythology and other stories that he really enjoys himself, the thing that he often borrows from more than anything else is his own past stories. He just takes different concepts and different characters and twists them and fits them into his new world that he's building. In addition to this, the reason that George R. R. Martin was brought on to work on Elden Ring in the first place was because Miyazaki was a big fan of George R. R. Martin and his past works. If you bring someone on who you're a big fan of their past work, you're probably going to want something that works in a very similar way to their past work, and if George R. R. Martin in his magnum opus has decided this is the way that magic works and this is the way that the world building and all of the magic tie together, well then it would make a lot of sense that they would want something similar from him for Elden Ring. I assume that Miyazaki, being a big George R. R. Martin fan, would actually directly want something that's pretty similar. This appreciation goes even beyond A Song of Ice and Fire, so he was like one of those OG fans who was a fan before George was even world famous the way that he is today. So to me it seems pretty obvious that if you are a huge fan of this author and you bring this author in to do the world building and lore building for your video game, you're obviously going to use a lot of his ideas and try to build around his ideas as much as you can. Which is why it was a little strange for me to find out that apparently in the Elden Ring community there is at least a certain group of people who sort of think that George really didn't have much to do with this, or a lot of the things that George did for the world building weren't actually used or didn't make it into the game. I do fully understand how that sort of happened. If you have only watched Game of Thrones, you would have missed a lot of the truly good world building that George did that sort of backs up a lot of these connections with Elden Ring. But at the same time, once you know George R. R. Martin's lore and once you're familiar with his past works in greater detail, the idea of saying that George R. R. Martin had nothing to do with Elden Ring or that the world building doesn't reflect George R. R. Martin's work is kind of as silly as if someone was, running a video game company that liked to make mystery games, and then they were talking glowingly about how big a fan they are of Scooby-Doo, and then they brought in the creator of Scooby-Doo to help work on their next game in their series, and suddenly that game comes out, and it turns out your partners for solving this big mystery are a talking dog and a stoner who ride around in a van and eat big sandwiches all the time. And then a bunch of people look at this and go, yeah, the creator of Scooby-Doo had nothing to do with this. And their general argument is basically, well, you were always solving mysteries in these games, and there was always dogs in the world, and I'm just sitting here like, well, yeah, but this one talks, and rides around with a stoner, and eats giant sandwiches in their van all the time. I think there's a connection going on here. So this is basically how I feel about the fact that Elden Ring is based around a giant magical tree that we've talked about for 2 episodes now has a ton of connections and similarities to how the Weirwoods work in A Song of Ice and Fire. There are obviously connections going on here, and I think you would be doing yourself a disservice if you're trying to understand the lore of either of these 2 properties and you're completely ignoring the other one. I do also just want to point out, I think that's something that might be throwing people off, in addition to how different the magic in the television show was from Martin's actual books, is a specific quote that came from Miyazaki in an interview. The one where he says that George R. R. Martin may be shocked to see what's happened to some of his characters, and he talks about how when George wrote these demigods, they were basically in a much more human form or closer to their original form, and it's been up to them to kind of warp and twist these things over the last 5,000 years of in-world history, and basically also just making them more monstrous and exciting for a video game. In my looking into Elden Ring lore, I've occasionally seen people referencing this quote as a way to essentially say that George had nothing to do with this world or the characters that we actually see in the game. But to me, that doesn't seem to be the correct way to take this, that they've somehow just thrown out everything that George built while they've adapted these demigods and this world over the several thousand years since the Shattering. As we'll see in an interview quote coming up here in just a moment with George himself, he talks about how he laid out a lot of this stuff, and he's laid out the characters, some of the powers that they have, some of their motivations, things like that, and even some of the ideas around the shattering. Also, it seems like he knew he was setting up the world for them to take and move forward thousands of years into the future. So, in a lot of cases, this is sort of like if, you had a chef who gave you a bunch of ingredients to work with, and you were like, oh yeah, he's going to be really surprised to see what I made. But in the end, he's probably going to have a pretty good idea of what went into that, and all of the things that went into it did originally come from him. So I take this idea that George is going to be completely shocked by these characters to mean more that, like, oh, he's going to be really excited to see what we've done with these ideas that he gave us, rather than like, oh, we've completely thrown out everything he gave us and he's going to be completely shocked by it. Now, I do also just want to point out that Miyazaki and George R.R. Martin are like a match made in heaven, it seems like, from what I can tell, because a lot of times they do cover the same themes and like to even use a lot of the same inspiration. So that does definitely make the lines blurry on what comes from George and what comes from FromSoft overall. I'm not saying it's an easy process or the ideas are clear-cut 100% George or 100% Miyazaki. I think there's definitely a lot of them that are a unique blend of the two, and that is definitely something that people are going to have to sort of piece together, and it's a big puzzle that we're all going to have to try to solve. So in order to make the solving of that puzzle just a little easier, I wanted to go back and look at some quotes from George R.R. Martin himself about what exactly he worked on this game.
Basically, they wanted a world created to set the game in. They wanted world building as a big factor in fantasy and science fiction. I worked up fairly detailed background for them, and then they took it from there.
There was actually going to be another clip here, but at the last moment I had to change it and re-record this little bit because Stephen Colbert was trying to take all of the money for the entire video if I used 20 seconds of a clip he did of an interview with George R.R. Martin. The important information from that clip was that George R.R. Martin said A, that he knew that they were going to set the world of Elden Ring in the present, but he was creating things that happened 5,000 years in the past, and B, he talked a little bit about what exactly he worked on, including the fact that he laid out essentially the shattering or how this rune was broken apart, essentially the thing that made the world so screwed up in the present, as well as laying out all the major characters and what powers they had and who was fighting who and things like that. If you want to fact check me on this, I guess you have to watch all of Stephen Colbert's video. You win this one, Colbert! Anyway, back to our regularly scheduled video. So George not only describes his world building as pretty detailed, but he also specifically says that he laid out a lot of the major characters, a lot of who was fighting who, what kind of powers they had. This is why when I've generally been looking for connections between these two properties, I'm focusing on the general magical rules of the universe, things like the demigods and things that have been around for a long time and are fundamental parts of the universe. I don't think, for example, George R.R. Martin was involved in specific quests or dialogue or things like that, and I'm not sitting here saying, oh, this guy that you meet in a tavern here is clearly a reference to Littlefinger or Lord Varys or Kevin. No, that's not what's going on. To further confirm this idea, I do want to point out an article that I'll have up on your screen right now that points out George R.R. Martin worked on the world building of Elden Ring, effectively its history and major figures, but not the game's plot. So to me, again, that feels like the demigods, the major important figures, you can look for some George R.R. Martin in there, but little random NPCs and things like that, if there are references to George R.R. Martin and his works, it's probably more of just a fun little fandom bit on the part of FromSoft because they just seem to really like George R.R. Martin. My general thesis is just straight up that George had a big influence on a lot of these major points in the world, and that if you were going to bring on someone who you're very fond of, like George R.R. Martin, you definitely wouldn't completely throw out all of the world building that he did just because the game is set thousands of years later. That's what some people seem to have taken this as, and that just, to me, isn't how it goes when you work on a video game. And for the record, I have actually worked on video games a little bit in the past, and am even currently doing a little bit of world building consulting and lore consulting for a game called Elemancer. It's a VR game that will have a Steam link down in the description if you're interested. But I'm just like a very minor consultant in that case. And I can tell you I've already had more influence than some people seem to think that George R.R. Martin had on Elden Ring, and I'm here to tell you that that's just not how it's going to work. George R.R. Martin had a pretty heavy influence on this game. I know more about how video games are made than I do about how novels are written, so I understand that things get sort of left aside when you're creating a game and certain ideas get taken out just because the game mechanics don't quite work, but at the same time, when you talk about world building on a significant level, there's no way that George's influence has been completely taken out. If you were planning to throw it all out and do your own thing anyway, you wouldn't bring on this guy who you're a big fan of and was likely costing you some money to have him do your world building. They definitely used a lot of George R.R. Martin when making Elden Ring. Now, if you want a little bit more detail and even more interview quotes and things like that, the YouTuber Jack is a Mimic actually just this week put out a video. It was actually today, the day that I'm recording this. I was going to go even deeper into looking into more, interview quotes and things like that, but he put out a video that actually basically just does all of that. So I'll have that linked in the playlist at the end. I'm going to add it to there. And it's a very good video that sort of breaks down even more of these quotes and makes the same exact point that yes, George was pretty heavily involved in a lot of this stuff. I also do just want to point out one fun little connection that I really do think is on some level or another a reference to George R.R. Martin, and that is a character affectionately known as Turtle Pope. You see, George R.R. Martin's favorite animal is a turtle, and it turns out that when he was a kid he had a bunch of pet turtles that he would get from a dime store, and basically the turtles would die relatively quickly. They weren't in very good shape. So in his head, the way that he coped with this is that he made up a big story about how they were all fighting for the turtle throne that he had in the tank that he kept the turtles in, and they were killing each other off so that they could take power. You can sort of see how this little story that he told himself as a kid ended up eventually inspiring him to write Game of Thrones. He has directly stated in interviews in the past that this is what happened, this is one of the things that inspired the novels that have made him so famous, and he's I think even said that if he had a sigil, it would be a turtle. In that interview you just saw with Stephen Colbert, he was wearing a pin with a jeweled turtle on the front of his hat. So I really do think the fact that you have a character in-game who is essentially just a big turtle wearing a Pope hat is a pretty funny little allusion to George R.R. Martin. The Pope is obviously supposed to be able to be the connecting point between the creator of the universe and people on Earth, so when you put a big turtle wearing a Pope hat in the world created by George R.R. Martin, to me that feels like it just lines up pretty well as a fun little Easter egg. I'm not sure if it goes any deeper than that, but let me know down in the comments if you know any more about Turtle Pope and there's any further connections that I'm possibly missing. The other thing that definitely stands out to me as something that could be related to some of George's past works and maybe something worth looking into for Elden Ring fans is the Godskin Noble and the Godskin Apostle. And as far as I can tell, these are two bosses who both follow the same tradition of essentially cloaking themselves in the skin of gods. Now, in the first video I did about the connections between these two properties, one of the things that I pointed out is how many similarities the line of Starks seems to have to this line of gods in Elden Ring. Essentially, the god Marika is granted on some level extra power, and her descendants are granted extra power based on the fact that she is crucified to this magical Erdtree. And in A Song of Ice and Fire, we see at least one Stark, Bran Stark, who is going to be wed to the trees and is gaining special power through his bloodline. Now, I've speculated in the past that these magical bloodlines in A Song of Ice and Fire likely have something to do with the fact that in the distant past, the ancestors of these bloodlines gave themselves over to these trees or to some other magical power source in some way, giving their bloodline access to this magic. So if the Starks are a somewhat magically toned down version of this godly bloodline that has special powers, it's very interesting that you have someone out there trying to skin these gods because, well, in A Song of Ice and Fire, one thing that's gone on throughout the history is the Boltons have been trying to skin the Starks. Obviously, if you're familiar with Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire, you know that Roose Bolton is a traitor to the Starks and his son Ramsay is an evil person who likes to flay people. The sigil of House Bolton is even the flayed man, and back in the Age of Heroes it's said that they had skins of the Starks who were flayed and hung up in the Dreadfort. Now, the Age of Heroes is when all these sort of figures like Bran the Builder and Lan the Clever and Garth the Green were supposedly out there and walking around, And these figures are, in a way, at least with the way their legends have grown over the ages, much more like gods than actual humans that we see in the story today. They are probably not actually gods on any level like America herself is, but at the same time, they are the historic godlike figures who founded all of these powerful houses that have all these powerful magical bloodlines. So if there were Starks who had some actual serious magical power back in the Age of Heroes, and the Boltons were trying to flay them and hang up their skin, well, that really does line up pretty well with the idea of skinning gods. The other place to look for a potential connection to George's work with the idea of skinning werewolves or skinning people to gain their power is the book Skin Trade, which George has worked on and you could find just by Googling it. I haven't actually read it myself, so I'm not going to go into any details of what actual connections could be found there, but it is a place to take a look if you're trying to find deeper connections between this whole idea, because it's another werewolf story that involves skinning. But back to the Boltons and their history of flaying Starks. Before the Boltons were actually subjugated by the Starks, they were known in history as the Red Kings, and it's said that at this point in history they actually would wear the skin of their flayed enemies, so this really lines up with the idea of the Godskin Noble or the Godskin Apostle. This is another one that basically I don't know if there's any real deeper connection or anything that can be learned about Elden Ring lore from these little connections that come to the Boltons or possibly to the Skin Trade, but there is definitely on some level or another connection there if someone who knows more about Elden Ring wanted to try dig into it deeper. Now, there are a lot more good comments that I got on my last video, and I'm sure this one is also going to generate a ton of good discussion down there in the comments, so this will absolutely not be the last time I'm going to be trying to dive into the connections between these two properties, but I have a little bit more research to do before any of that takes place. I have a few other videos that I want to get made and put out on the channel in the meantime, but definitely a part 3 is coming, so if you've made it this far into this video, make sure you check out part 1, make sure you hit that like and subscribe before you go, and I'll be back with something else very soon.